Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet. Spinning around the sun, still wrapped sadly in a pandemic. Here in the United States and parts of Europe and other parts of the world, it feels like we're getting back to normal. There's baseball games and soccer matches, and it's grand feeling after 14, 15 months of lockdown. But there's still close to 7 billion people, 7 billion on a planet of 7.8 billion who have not seen yet one shot, let alone 2 shots of the vaccine. There's enormous work to be done before we get back to anything we can call a post-pandemic period. That's a predicate to a bigger discussion on risk. And today we'll be talking about climate risk and solutions, and also a little bit about framing. Climate change, I've been writing about since the 80s. And I came to it first as a science reporter writing about the science. You know, greenhouse gases are coming in the atmosphere. They warm the planet, does this, that, and the other. And including things that are a risk to communities. But I found that in looking at work, especially of geographers, you're going to meet 2 today, who are climate-focused scientists, you realize, it took me too long to realize that there are vital issues where the thing driving risk on the ground is not change in the climate yet. And my camera just clicked off for some reason, but we'll fix that in a second. I think you can still hear me. Just nod your heads if you can hear me. I am still here, not in Svalbard where that picture was taken. Today, I'm pleased to introduce folks to, if you haven't met them before, to Laurens Bauwer, who's a Dutch climate analyst, very focused on risk, and you'll learn more about where he works and the like in a minute. And Diana Liverman at the University of Arizona, they're both past IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change authors, deeply involved in this question of what do communities do and what do we do globally to reduce risk from climate change, even as we slow climate change, and to reduce risk from climate hazards that are just there already. I'm going to start with a little clip from Jeff Berardelli, who's just got his master's degree in sustainability science from Columbia University. He's a longtime CBS correspondent, weather forecaster, predictor, presenter, and he's going to tell you about where Diana is in the world. That corner of the world is seeing extraordinary temperatures, and let's see if this works.
The heat wave right now is nothing short of epic. It's about as hot as it can possibly get this time of year. Look at this. All-time record highs, 108 degrees yesterday in Billings, Montana. And that heat will continue and build west into California, which is parched. 116 in Las Vegas today. Look at Sacramento tomorrow, 110 degrees there. Redding, 110. And the heat splits. Notice Lincoln, Nebraska, 104 degrees. This is on top of the worst drought in modern history in the West. Look at these stats. The driest 12-month period on record going on right now. And this is now the worst 20-year drought in at least 1,200 years in the West. So are we going to see any relief? No, because it's dry season in the West, not a drop, or basically not a drop. But the places that we've seen 3 feet of rain, like Baton Rouge in the last 3 months, another 6 to 12 inches of rain. The heat wave right now is nothing short of epic.
So you get the idea there. And Diana, you're living this right now. And maybe you could both unmute. That'd be great, and I can introduce you more. But you're in Arizona, and even though you're not from the region originally, and this is a region that always gets hot and has vulnerabilities to heat. But as he said there, too, we're getting into the range of true historic on long time scale change. So when you, Diana, as a geographer and climate scientist, look at the situation in a place like the Southwest, how do you talk to your neighbors about what to think about the future?
Well, it's really hot. It's way above what we would normally get. We've been breaking records. Tucson was 115, 116 Fahrenheit yesterday. That's sort of above 45 degrees C. And it's for a sustained number of days. And I think one of the things that we see is an impact that's been projected for a long time by people like Jonathan Overpeck and Brad Udall, which is when it gets that hot, you've got massive evaporation. So on top of the lack of snow and rain that we had over the winter, we're now seeing the water just evaporate up into the atmosphere under these high temperatures. I look out my window, I can see trees that have sustained drought and high temperatures for decades that are now under stress. The saguaros are all bursting into flower, which is what they do when they're under unbelievable stress. And we're really worried about people who can't afford air conditioning, the homeless, the tribal groups that are particularly vulnerable to this sort of heat wave. But going back for many years, if you look at the maps of projected global warming, the west of the US has always been highlighted as a hotspot. So if you're looking at 1 degree of warming globally, it's higher than that here, according to all the models. So we really are one of the spots where we expected to see these sort of impacts.
And this also affects, as you were saying, the power supplies can be imperiled. You had an internet outage earlier, but there's places around the West now that are really on the verge of real serious power crunch as well. There was just a report, let me see if I can show this, from the Homeland Security Today magazine says more than half of US and Canadian power executives, when they were in a survey recently, cited extreme weather resilience as their biggest challenge.
Yeah.
So we saw that in Texas.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing it for cold and hot.
Yeah, and in California, they have to cut the power because of the risk of fire when you have these high winds and droughts. So there are multiple ways that it's affecting the power grid.
It's all kind of connected.
Yeah.
And the feedbacks are there too. Here's that piece that was just written, showing, again, this is a significant issue. So Lawrence, you're from the Netherlands, right?
Yes, that's correct. Working in Germany since a few years, but yes.
I've always gotten this impression in my reporting that the Netherlands, because it's so low in Nederland, and because you had an epic disaster in 1953, you seem particularly set up or sort of thinking about risk in a different way than a lot of other countries. Does it feel like there's a special sensibility there from past experience?
Yes, I think there is, but it's not just a disaster, because I think many countries have been hit in the past by large disasters, be it an earthquake or a large scale flooding, as we had in the Netherlands in '53. I think it's a combination of many centuries of experience in managing the water and managing the coast and living in such low country, combined with, I think, a bit of culture where people are okay with paying for public services, but they want it to be, the system to be efficient. And I think one reason is that the Netherlands is protected so well is actually that some economists also worked on the subject after the disaster, and they argued that there is actually a kind of minimum protection that you need to put in place that is also worthwhile to invest in, and you can show that from economic theory and economic calculations, and that is why the Netherlands is so well protected, because there is so much to lose. So much of the country is below sea level. There are many millions of people living around or below sea level, that it was decided such a disaster should not happen again, and engineers and economists started calculating what is the required level of protection, and this is why since the 1950s the system is put in place, and also why this risk thinking really came about very strongly in public policy making.
Lawrence, could I just ask you, because I just watched the TV series that was called The Swell here, and It blew me away. I don't know if you've seen it. And
yes, of course.
It's a series. It's sci-fi or cli-fi or whatever we call it. But it's about the limits to adaptation in the Netherlands, about what happens with sea level rise and severe storms. And I thought it was a very powerful demonstration of how we think we're well adapted, but climate change is going to overcome those. And it was also powerful showing the shock of Dutch people being climate refugees in their own country. But I assume there was a debate about it, but I thought it was pretty powerful.
Yes. No, it was also made a big impact in the Netherlands as well. And I think for a good reason. I mean, you can have a very good protection system in place, but the main message, of course, is it ever safe enough? And what are the risks of climate change also? Because in the series there is this big chunk of Antarctica that breaks off and causes very rapid climate change and this incredibly strong storm. So I think it made an impact indeed as well. And actually, several years before already, also in with policymakers, there was a concern that yes, you can have a lot of protective infrastructure in place, but you must also think about the situation when a disaster does happen. And a lot of work has been put in working out scenarios that a flooding does occur. What do you need to do to evacuate? Exactly the situation in the series, that people get stuck in deep boulders and cannot get away because the highways are blocked. I think in the US there's much more experience in dealing with that and actually a much better response to such situations than we have in the Netherlands. And it triggered a debate. These are the images.
I'm showing some scenes.
Yeah. And so it made also an impact on policymakers and on science even, triggering a lot of work to think about situations when this would occur and to question to what extent we need to prepare for situations like this, not just because of climate change, but just as an extra layer of safety and response.
That's so interesting. I was going to get to the question of how do we tell the story better toward the end of the chat here, but here we are in the middle of it. I'll have to find out more about how that series came about, and it seems very different than let's say The Day After Tomorrow, which was that epic disaster film that sort of fast forwarded the big freeze from a global warming, and this seems much more pinned to real world kind of realities. Interesting. Hold on, let me just get out of that. And now I've got to watch it.
It's 6 hours.
Oh, that's fine. You know, we tend to have time for these kinds of things. My son is also a filmmaker, so we'll have to check it out. But let's get back to the primal question here. It's one that I think about a lot, as I said earlier, which is if I had to start all over, if I went back to, but not 1988 when I wrote this, but let's say the mid 90s, where I was writing hundreds of articles for the New York Times at a certain point on climate change, what's happening with sea ice. And I still hadn't really put the risk element in the foreground. And sometimes I think we would have been better off with an intergovernmental panel on climate risk than an intergovernmental panel on climate change, because it puts the element in the foreground that societies really care about, which is, am I at risk? From what? What do I do? Is that valid? Has it just been too backgrounded? That it seems sort of like a basic thing to talk about risk.
Yeah, I think also the science grew. I think the connection between more traditional natural hazard and risk research and climate change, I think, came about maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I think if you look back at the history of IPCC, it was mostly a panel also yes, pushing the risk of impacts. So demonstrating what is potentially going to happen if particular emissions are not reduced. The focus was very strongly on mitigation. There was a belief that, a hope that by demonstrating the science behind climate, there was sufficient momentum to pull it off with the Climate Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, and there was also a bit of a hesitation to talk about adjusting the risks in other ways than through mitigation, so through adaptation, for instance.
And Diana.
But Diana can certainly add to that, yeah.
Well, I'm older than Lawrence, and I'm going to actually suggest that we were talking about climate risk back in the late 1970s. I was a student at the University of Toronto, and the great Canadian climatologist Ken Hare was talking about risks from climate change. Ian Burton, who was on my committee and is like he's the father of climate adaptation, they were talking about hazards in terms of risk. But I do think there is a risk in talking about climate risk. I think a lot of people still hear climate risk as something biophysical, whereas those of us in the IPCC know or understand risk to be a combination of the physical climate change with vulnerability. And so when we talk about climate risk, some people still just think, oh, it's the probability of a heat wave. But we need to think about risk not as the probability of the heat wave, but as the probability of harm. Exactly.
Right. I show this slide quite frequently to reporters because I think journalists have missed this quite a bit. We get seduced by the science, which is just what you were saying. You know, how much is a hurricane being intensified by global heating? That's a really interesting story.
Yeah.
But vulnerability to hurricanes is a very different story, and it's very powerfully. We've had these surges of built exposure to storms in places where communities are poor or vulnerable, and it misses the headlines. So this is sort of like, I'm glad that we're having this conversation, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think Lawrence, your work has gotten at this. Let me just show. Here's another. In most climate and coastal danger zones, this is my perception. The dominant driver of losses is growing exposure and vulnerability change. In other words, the knob that you can turn potentially is moving out of harm's way or building better, that kind of thing. And this was this summary you did. It was a chapter in a book that really nailed down that you won't be able to actually get a signal in loss, at least in losses, of the broader issue of global warming driving changes and hazards for quite a long time to come. That the things that you are driving damage are here and now, things on the ground. Has this been adequately absorbed?
I think among many scientists, yes, but the graph you just showed on how climate risk is actually made up of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. You can even show that to many scientists, I think, because there's still a perception with many that if they calculate what the hazard is going to be in 20 or 30 years from now, or how it is today, then they're done, and it's not true, because you need to take into account the other two important factors as well. And in the research that you just showed, I show that actually. This is also what a lot of the research is showing in many ways. First of all, that exposure, as you already mentioned, there's a lot of development in places that people maybe should not consider moving into. So coastal areas, river basins, areas that are already under great hazard. Is a very important driver that we see many of the impacts and the losses. At the same time, we're also being extremely successful at reducing vulnerability. There are several studies that show that despite the huge population that we have on the planet today, you mentioned it already, 7.8 billion. if you compare the 1940s or 1950s, when we didn't have satellites, we didn't have forecasting systems in place, we didn't understand weather systems that well, or we could not predict them very well. There were many more lives lost than today, even though the global population has expanded dramatically. So we can also show that we can be very effective as humans to reduce our vulnerability. At the same question is, what is the limit? And Diane already mentioned that. Can we modify climate change away by turning the other knobs, as it were, to reduce our exposure and to reduce our vulnerability? And that's a big question. I think there are many unknowns, and there are many indications also that we cannot. And there's a very big need also to drastically reduce the climate hazard in the future.
I think the quote you just showed from Lawrence doesn't mention one very important set of variables that I know he's also worked on, which is, in addition to sort of population growth and other factors, poverty is massively important in explaining vulnerability. And we see a lot of parts of the world, even though we've brought millions of people out of poverty, that there are parts of the world where aspects of poverty make people very vulnerable. So if you're a poor person, yeah, exactly, great example. But the work we've done in Mexico and in other regions shows that if you're poor and they privatize your water, it makes you more vulnerable. If you're an indigenous community and somebody steals your land, you're vulnerable. There are so many ways in which addressing basic social welfare can reduce vulnerability, whether it's in New Orleans or Mexico City. So, and we're seeing that right now with the heat wave here. It's the poor who can't afford to pay for air conditioning, who can't afford to insulate their homes, and who are living on the streets or working in outdoors occupations in 115 degrees Fahrenheit.
This issue is, to me, again, I think it's starting to get into the news cycle more, and here I am after writing about global warming for all these years, pointing increasingly to issues like here in Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, where it was migrant workers from Haiti who were living in horrible conditions in a slum nicknamed the Mud. That's the name of the slum, because it's flood prone. They should have been the story. And then the story is about, why are there Haitian migrants working in the Bahamas? Well, it's the tourism industry. What are they building? Why are they inadequate? Why is their housing inadequate? It's not a story about global warming, nor should it be, because it's an area prone to hurricanes. So I think some work needs to be done in how we look at these challenges.
I mean, just think about who's working in the fields in the West right now and suffering heat stroke. It's migrant workers. And of course, the intersection of poverty with race and racism is another element that adds to vulnerability, where I think there is a lot more awareness in North America. I'd be interested as to whether that's come up in the European context. But we know from empirical studies, as well as sort of theoretical work, that people of color and indigenous communities are more vulnerable and often don't receive the help that better off people are getting.
Yeah, I know. And but here, I think this is where the climate campaign movement has a challenge or an opportunity. To me, the opportunity is to make the issue more about climate risk. And I know this, as Lauren said earlier, but that takes away the focus on mitigating emissions of greenhouse gases. That was historically the main focus of most environmental groups coming to this issue, as opposed to, if risk is in the foreground, you start to say, well, who is at risk? Why are they at risk? What do you do about that? It starts to address the points that you were just making, Diana. And it will always feel uncomfortable to those whose lens is on slowing global warming through greenhouse gases cuts. it seems like that's the toughest part of this. I don't know if that feels, maybe Lawrence, have you run into this? Do you get pushback?
Yes and no. I mean, the issue I think is also that climate risk is traditionally very much focused also, or at least in many of the more quantitative studies that look at risk from a kind of financial or economic point of view, is very much focused on economics and costs. And there is actually, there are some developments to much better take into account equity issues and distribution effects of natural hazards. And there's indeed also from extreme weather events, there's a lot of empirical work that yes, the less affluent are worse off in almost any country. So it doesn't exclude Europe or any other country or any other location. The question then, from at least from a scientific standpoint, then is, okay, how do we account for that, and how do we find other metrics or other ways to account for that? And there is indeed a movement or development to better take that into account. Also because a lot of the organizations that try to improve the situation in many of the developing countries, for instance, such as the development banks, they're also uncomfortable with the outcomes of many of the research and also the consultancy that I've also been involved in studying, for instance, the flood hazard and the flood risk in many locations, is that it doesn't take into account that some people are worse off than others, and how can we make sure that that is taken up in the decision making also on whom to protect and whom to protect first, both from the climate mitigation point of view, but also from the natural hazard risk management perspective, where a lot of governments, but also development banks, are investing in protection. You need to take into account that some people have a higher vulnerability, and this is definitely, I would say, since some years, this is a point of attention in improving situation.
But I think the contradiction or the tension between mitigation and adaptation, it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, I'm now on my local mayor, the mayor of Tucson, Regina Romero, has a climate committee, and we're spending a lot of time trying to find win-win or triple wins even, where, you know, planting trees takes up carbon dioxide, but also shades and cools, where energy efficiency reduces emissions and also makes people less vulnerable. And then my colleague, Greg Barron-Gafford, is working on agrivoltaics, which is really exciting, where you plant crops under solar panels, because in high temperatures like we have right now, the panels actually aren't that efficient. But if you put crops under them, it cools the panels, makes them more efficient, shades the crops so that they don't need much water. And that's a really excellent win-win, where you've got solar energy helping adapt crops to climate change. So I think looking for those multiple wins, it's not going to work for everything. And the one other thing I'd say is, even if we had only focused on mitigation, because those greenhouse gases are up there for decades, we're seeing the warming. And one of the things I learned from the IPCC 1.5 report is it's going to get warmer before, however hard we mitigate, it gets cooler again. So we have to focus on risk and vulnerability adaptation at the same time.
You know, I wasn't going to bring this up, but there's another element at the global scale or at the continental scale that comes to mind when you talk about thinking of ending poverty as a climate risk reduction strategy, and its uncertainty. This is a slide I show sometimes. It's actually from a World Bank analysis of what the precipitation future will be like in Africa under a certain emission scenario. And it could be wetter or drier. At least in the sort of central equatorial Africa, there's a lot of uncertainty. But you also know these are areas prone to flooding and prone to drought, and where you're going to double population between now and 2050. Nigeria is 5 children per household. So if you're not thinking about poverty if poverty alleviation is a prime driver of resilience, adaptability, and you don't know what global warming is going to bring in terms of moisture, it feels like it even reinforces that the importance of putting that in the foreground, unless I'm missing something.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, there are many ways that you can deal with this type of uncertainty, and one would be, and that's actually also being done by many studies and by many scientists, is to think about robust strategies that are effective for adaptation under different scenarios. So if you don't know if it's going to be drier, wetter, or combination of drier and wetter, what are systems for crop production? What are livelihoods that people can have that are effective and robust under both possible futures? And such work is being done and being considered. So it's not a linear analysis of, okay, what's the future going to be? Then I'll tell you what you need to do. It's much more exploring about what are different futures under high and low climate change, but also different directions of changes in rainfall, for instance. So those ideas are being explored. And your point on improving the poverty situation, yes, I think this is very important. That people are offered ways to get out of poverty and to improve their situation, also to decide themselves about how they would want to live and have a livelihood. I think those are very important things.
But we have to,
No.
Provide people with low carbon choices and low carbon pathways out of poverty.
Right.
And I do think that that's possible. But let me go to a point that I make whenever I can, is you mentioned Nigeria, Andy, and the higher fertility rate there. I mean, in most of the world, the population problem is being solved through women's rights and women choosing to have less children. And so I always get a little bit concerned when population is important, but it's probably been solved more than any of the other drivers by giving women rights around the world.
Exactly.
And of course, as people become less poor, they tend to have less children. So for countries like Nigeria, and you should talk to my colleague Chuck Sokoreki, who is Nigerian and a great thinker on what Nigeria needs to do about climate change. I mean, he would argue that it's about governance, it's about meeting the SDGs, and it's about getting alternatives to fossil fuels for Nigeria in terms of its trade.
No, this is great. I'm taking notes. There's clearly stories that come out of this, including agrivoltaics, that idea of mediating the heat on panels and growing crops at the same time. And it also reminds me, what we're talking about reminds me of something I just have to show, which I was really excited to be reading about recently. Hold on here. It gets at this idea of development, shaping development in a way that works. It has to be sort of a granular thing. Someone has to be aware of the situation on the ground and what people are doing now and what they could do differently that could actually improve their economics and their adaptability. And there was a couple of organizations in Bangladesh that had, they're shifting farmers from chicken cultivation to ducks. And not only do they have a better market, higher value output, because duck is very popular in big chunks of South Asia, but of course they're much more flood. They don't lose their chicken pens and everything in the flooding. And it seems like it gets to that win-win-win idea you were just describing. Do you feel, I'm going to ask each of you now whether you feel, when you think of the current situation, you're hearing so much dire discourse around climate. The Guardian insists now you have to call it an emergency if you're a reporter. How does that make you feel? And what does it make you want to do or to spread? What's the thing that's not happening that relates to all the wisdom you have that could be happening more? Maybe Diana first.
Yeah. Well, I've been feeling a little bit guilty ever since I was a lead author for the 1.5 report, which had an enormous impact. But I realized, especially in talking to my students and young people, it almost paralyzed people. What they heard us say was that if you don't act in 12 years, the world's going to fall apart. It's going to be the apocalypse. And we never said that. We just said, in order to stay under 1.5, we need to cut emissions in the next 12 years, or it will be a bit warmer. We didn't say things were going to fall apart. And whilst I'm very happy at the impact of that report, I do think that it created a sense of panic and grief that the way the media spun it anyway, that has made me feel bad and made me want to focus a lot more on positive side of things. The other thing that I think is important to think about, and there's some people writing about this now, is there can be some negative sides to declaring an emergency. So 9/11 was seen as an emergency, but ended up with, a police state across the southern border. So declaring emergencies can give people excuses to get rid of democratic rights in order to respond to the emergency. So we need to think through the implications of declaring this as the emergency and make sure that the response then is as democratic and inclusive as possible. Although the irony is that people write about how much easier it is in China if you decide you want to do something about emissions. You've got an authoritarian government and you can do it, whereas in the US, you've got divided government and it's much harder.
Although, again, in China, you have Uyghur conscripted populations making solar panels. That's not the solution we would ever want.
Slave labor, yeah.
Right, which gets, I think it makes your point that be careful how you define these terms. And Lawrence, again, you're can you talk about your organization and how you function in advising governments and like?
Yeah, happy to do that.
What's the advice?
What's the advice? Well, the advice would be not to call it an emergency, and I'm also very wary of all the warnings that we have only 1 year or 10 years or. I think it's about choices. Huh? So I think as scientists or advisors, we should explain what the consequences are if we don't act now, or if we would act now. And I fully agree with Diana on the we need a positive spin, and we need also that people feel that they can contribute. At the same time, there's also a lot of frustration, I think, moving forward that I see in many places. So I think the whole emergency and crisis also puts a lot of blame on individuals, while in fact a lot of citizens are not able to choose about low carbon options. I mean, if I live in a country where my cheapest transport option is a high emitting car because fossil fuel is subsidized and there's no alternative transport system, then what can you do as an individual to make it better? So I think it is much more discussion about choices, and choices that especially governments can make for us, or as democratically chosen organizations. And then we come, of course, to the issue. Well, that's not the situation in all countries, and that's also something to consider, that it's not so easy to achieve what we would want. The other point I wanted to make is that we must also be very sensitive to yes, there's a huge speed up. So I'm actually quite positive about the current momentum we see on climate change. I think there is a genuine conviction among many people that we will not hit a very high scenario for climate change. Still, it's not looking good. I think we should do definitely more. But the question is how, and I see also many people are reluctant to accept windmills close to their communities, and there's a lot of friction there. So I think when governments want to go this route of the Paris Agreement, they must be very sensitive also to what people want, what route they want. Do they want maybe more costly mitigation actions with windmills on the sea instead of on the land, if they get better quality of their landscape. And I think such discussions are not always made because of the argument we must do this and we must save the climate. Well, not at all costs. I think this dialogue is needed to make sure that there's sufficient support for this difficult difficult route.
I'm going to try to articulate something that feels like at least it's one of the failures so far, including in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the easiest way to say this. It feels to me like if we did a fresh assessment of what's dangerous climate change, just like we're starting now, fresh. And we know that there's a lot that can be done through poverty alleviation and or local work to make the most vulnerable populations less vulnerable. So we know those things. It would seem obvious that you would want to integrate general development investment of rich countries and poor countries into reducing vulnerability, right? And that there was a chunk of the climate treaty that's supposed to do that. There was $100 billion a year by last year that was supposed to be flowing. It's not flowing. A lot of what is flowing is just redefined money. It's not new money. So it just feels like that failure could be turned into a success if something changed. I'm not sure whether it's wishful thinking. Maybe Diana first on that question.
Well,
what I was going to say is it could kind of redefine danger. Like if you, does that give us more of a slope on the curve forward toward, bad outcomes?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, if we had put that money on the table in terms of climate finance, it would have made a difference. And not much of it has gone to adaptation. It mostly went to mitigation of the paltry amount that did flow. But we also have to be careful there. So I just worked on a paper that came out in World Development with actually a lot of people from Europe, led by Siri Eriksson. And we looked for the Norwegian Development Agency at a whole bunch of adaptation projects that had all been promoted as successes. And we found a lot of problems with the projects. Some of them increased inequality. A number of them weren't sustainable. And so we need those finance flows, but we also need to think very carefully about effectiveness and equity in the response to climate change. And there are studies out there. I'm just not sure that people are paying enough attention in how to design projects that are sustainable development projects that actually don't harm anybody in the process of trying to do good.
Or they're just missing the most vulnerable populations too?
Yes, in many cases they are, because the most vulnerable populations are not accessible. They may not have the capacity to use the technologies or the information. But we know there's a lot of work that does show us better how to reach the most vulnerable. And I sometimes think that the climate and climate finance community in the UNFCCC hasn't actually learned enough from the broader development literature and evaluation literature, that we need to talk to the development practitioners to draw on what they have learned. So,
well, that resonates with what I've heard from people in disaster risk reduction, who feel like the lessons they've learned through decades haven't been absorbed in the climate discussions either.
Yeah, for sure.
Lawrence.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, you also asked about what we do as an organization. So we are we are the Climate Service Center in Germany, not exclusively working in Germany. We also advise a lot of other organizations in many other countries. So, and one sector is indeed the development community that we advise. Hi, there's my son. There's the next generation knocking on the door. Here's Paul.
Hey, he can say hi. Hey.
Yeah. I'll be right with you.
Daddy, what are you doing?
I love it.
Yeah.
That's what we work for.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we do this for. So we advise the development community also on the topic of climate change, and we work with them. So our model is basically that we develop services that are sustainable and that are mindful of both climate as well as development, obviously. But we also noticed that with a lot of development organizations, there are many priorities they need to take. They need to take care of environment. They need to take care of equity. Climate comes on top. Maybe natural disasters as well. And they're also they're improving. They have, I think, almost all large development organizations have now systems in place to take care of climate risk. Actually, so they also acknowledge this. Different layers of risk, both the climate side, but also the exposure and vulnerability and so on. Also poverty is integrated into that. But they are also struggling on how to actually make that work in a very complex world in countries where the situation is not always easy with respect to governance, with respect to access of information, priorities that countries set themselves for the sectors they want to work on, and so on. So I think a lot of good things are happening. There are a lot of people in the community that are really wanting to make this work. It's just incredibly complex, and but as Diane said, the knowledge is there. It has come through. People are aware, and people are working on it. It will just take, let's say, several more years before successful examples can be shown much more widely.
Is there some place on the planet either of you have been that illustrates best this future that can emerge? Maybe Diana first. Maybe Diana. Maybe it is Tucson.
I don't think it's Tucson. I mean, the challenge for Tucson is actually, it's true of many cities, is we don't completely control everything that's happening to us. I mean, food security in Tucson, the majority of our food comes from somewhere else, and
right.
We can't control what climate does. We can't grow enough food locally. And our city has not incorporated the wealthiest areas of our county. So they're not even getting the tax revenue that we need to respond to climate change. I would say that I think taking a look at cities is really useful. I mean, half the world's population lives in cities. In many parts of the world, including the developing world, there is good leadership at the city level, and the work of people like, I don't know, Jume Bai in Australia, Harriet Bulk in the UK, is really demonstrating that cities have experimented with responding to climate change, and many of them are doing pretty well compared to the countries that they sit in. And we saw that in the US during the Trump administration. The cities went ahead with their climate planning, even though the federal government was backtracking.
I'm looking over on Twitter. This is
yep.
Here's a good news, bad news tweet from CDP. This is what is CDP?
Carbon Disclosure Project.
Yes. They
but
say
it's pretty good. 6 in 10 have.
I know that was exactly what I was thinking. I was reading that the other way around. 6 in 10 cities have carried out a climate risk and vulnerability assessment. That feels like really good progress.
My student James Cunningham just did a master's on California looking at cities, and none of them, well, maybe 2 out of 40 had actually included vulnerability and intersectional vulnerability in their climate plans. So this is pretty different from what we found in California. In terms of the focus on vulnerability, a lot of cities look at their scenarios for sea level rise, but they don't look at who's going to be most affected.
Yeah, that issue is so critical. Who is at risk? You know, I do see the New York Times did a really good story a year or so ago where they mapped heat vulnerability and the history of racism, sort of what's called redlining in the United States. And lo and behold, within cities, the areas that are most vulnerable to extreme heat are areas that were redlined in the 1930s. So you're building, and that kind of reporting and that kind of analysis can be done anywhere.
The city of South Tucson, which is the predominantly Latinx part of our community, we've done remote sensing studies that show that they don't have the trees, they don't have the shade cover, they don't have the quality of housing that the wealthier parts of the city have.
And again, the world is just a bigger map of the same thing. I want to show two images before we close out with a couple last thoughts from each of you. And these come from a story, a package I worked on in 2007 with some other reporters called The Climate Divide. And here we go. So I think it was Sharon Lafreniere who was reporting from Malawi, where their meteorology budget was tiny. I think it was like $100,000 a year. And the meteorologist said, we can't even know the duration of sunshine in our country for 4 years. How can we measure climate change? And meanwhile, they were terribly vulnerable to both flood and drought, of course. They've started to work with fertilizer access, which is great. It's changing their agricultural production. The same year, that same story, Sarah Lyle went to the Netherlands. There was a hot story there at the time where these river communities were being built that were where the buildings, the houses, individual houses can float. Lawrence, I don't know, maybe you live in one, but I'll never forget this quote that Sarah got when she was talking to a homeowner who said, we haven't floated, but we're looking forward to floating. And somehow or other, these two images, these two realities faced with climate variability and extremes so powerfully made the point to me that the gap in vulnerability can be narrowed dramatically. Not everyone in Malawi is going to live on a floating house.
Yeah.
But it shows you there's so much work to be done there.
But the information gap that the first slide showed, in terms of people not even having meteorological stations, that's true on the Navajo reservation, for example, in the Southwest. We're working in Guatemala to try to use proxies, tree rings, satellite imagery to provide better climate information in Guatemala. And this is the idea, I think, Lawrence, of climate services, right, is sometimes it's just a case of getting another way to get people information about what's happening now, let alone what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, there are certainly low cost possibilities to actually provide a lot of that information, and there are efforts to do that. There are citizen science projects also in other countries. There are ways to have cheap sensors put in place. Satellite data is improving indeed. So there's a lot of positive news. Still, in terms of equity, indeed there is a divide. I mean that you can build a house that floats in the Netherlands and that we are not even able to observe the weather in parts of Africa and many other parts of the world is a divide that we cannot so easily close, and that indeed shows the inequity that we can only solve by lifting people out of poverty, educating them, put systems in place that people can decide about their own livelihoods, about their own future, about the government, about the decisions being made at higher levels, and so on. That's eventually what will bring about a change that it's less unequal.
I wanted to close us out with your, again, circling back to your positive visions, and both of you are fountains of ideas and insights that can lead us to a safer relationship with the climate system. I think on a time scale that feels like there's no need for despair at any respect. These images stay in my head. Two of them are from right where I live, the ones on the right, and the two on the left were taken by Charles Colton, who's a geographer, I think, at in Louisiana. And the one on the left shows a house built in the 1980s, probably, that was flooded outside of Baton Rouge in a 40 inches of rain in about 2 days. The house below it was built in the mid 1800s in Louisiana, and you can see a very significant difference. It was built off the ground, so we forgot something in that part of Louisiana. And on the right, of course, you have sunny day, well, normal day flooding on a high tide, moon high tide, in an area where some of that architecture is old and some of it's new. And you have a house that was built as a passive house, the one on the bottom. I know the woman who now lives in it. So it has almost no energy footprint, and it's designed to flood. And I see these things again and again, and they remind me that we're not stuck. There are things to work on right away. So just a last round from each of you on what is not stuck that people haven't really absorbed yet. You know, if you could talk to a young person, particularly who is feeling that sense of grief and paralysis, what would you say? And maybe Lawrence, and then Diana, you could close things out.
Yeah, I think indeed we must tell stories about positive and possibilities. We know that from a lot of the natural hazard researchers that you must not threaten with risks or with bad stories, but paint possibilities and show what is possible if you make certain choices. So I would say to a young person that yes, we can solve this. There are many ways to do this, and I think a lot of people are also finding quality in many of the low carbon options that we have available. We must just appreciate them more. And I really like these pictures, by the way, Andy, because I think they indeed show that a lot of the knowledge and understanding that people had in the past about their environment are maybe have become underappreciated. And there's also examples from the Netherlands where exactly this has happened, that people that live in the old houses have much less flood damage. They know how to respond to a flood. They move the furniture away to a higher floor and so on. And the people in new houses, they never experienced that. So we must tell stories about the risks, but also about the opportunities and the good quality of life that people can have in a passive house.
The Netherlands did a good job of harnessing wind energy early on too, hundreds of years ago.
Yes.
My reaction to the photos, Andy, is still, these are not photos that really address the billions of people who are poor. And so I want images of things like the elevated community evacuation centers in Bangladesh that have massively reduced vulnerability, small-scale solar desalination on the Navajo reservation that provides clean water and light. There are lots of examples of smaller scale local technologies that we can do. But when I actually, rather than give hope to my students, I find I get hope from them. I mean, I taught a class this year. U of A has very diverse student population, a lot of low income first generation, and they're activists. They care. They're lobbying the university for divestment. They're working in their communities. They're starting their own NGOs. And so really, I just want to support them in their action and hope, and find small amounts of money to help them do their projects, because I think we have a generation, not just in universities, but also in our elementary schools, where kids care about nature and they care about climate change, who can make a difference. And I think we're seeing them make a difference in their impact on policy in the US, for example. So I'll still try to provide info on hope, but a lot of the times they're my hope.
So fostering their capacity to meaningfully engage and push forward is, we should stand back, get out of the way, and facilitate. That sounds like a great path to accelerating change the way that needs to be done. here's just a quick look at the Navajo. This is one Navajo project turning solar energy into water. So thank you, Diana Liverman from University of Arizona and Lawrence Bauer from the German, what's the name of the institute?
German Climate Service Center, but we have a strange abbreviation.
I know. Well, it's great to have you both here. Lawrence, particularly, I've been trying to chat with you for a long time. I've been following your work since I first wrote about it.
Sorry to be so difficult to catch.
No, it's great. And maybe we can check back in periodically to see how things are going. And Diana, I'm definitely going to follow up on the agrivoltaics and your colleague working in Nigeria. Thanks for being here today. So this is the Earth Institute Sustain What series of conversations, trying to make progress where complexity and consequence collide, which is basically all around us these days, whether the pandemic or climate challenges or CRISPR or cyber, we're surrounded by puzzles that need a lot of work. And so tune in, you can look at that little scrolling bar, those who are watching, to see how to get in touch with me with ideas for future episodes of feedback on this one. And stay safe. It's easier now in our countries to stay safer. Get outside when you can, avoid the heat at the same time, and just stay well. So thank you both for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy.